Hello podcasters, thank you for joining me for this special mini episode of Living History. I'm here at the Kokoda Memorial Walkway at Concord in Sydney's inner west, and I'm actually here to interview a couple of Kokoda veterans, which I'm really excited about, so look out for that podcast in the coming weeks. But I'm also here at what must be one of the best living war memorials, certainly in Australia, certainly in Sydney, and I'm going to go and check it out while I'm here. So basically this is the Kokoda Memorial Walkway. It's been here for about 20 years. It's right near Concord Repatriation Hospital, which is famous in Australian military history as well as a place where lots of soldiers went after the Second World War in particular. And so the Kokoda Memorial Walkway traces along the foreshore, and it's basically laid out in stops the same as the Kokoda track. So there's stops that represent each phase of the battle and a huge memorial in the middle. So I hadn't been here before. I'm really looking forward to exploring it. And I'm going to take you with me. So come and join me. There'll be photos and videos up on the Facebook page, so certainly check those out. But let's go and explore the Kokoda Memorial Walkway. I'm standing in the Bruce Kingsbury VC Memorial Rose Garden, directly in front of Concord Repatriation Hospital, and Concord Hospital is famous for the number of war veterans that it has treated over the years, probably the most famous war veterans hospital in Sydney. And I'm standing now in this beautiful rose garden. The roses aren't out at this time of the year, but I'm surrounded by these incredible memorials put here by individuals and units to the men who served in the Kokoda campaign. Some really special memorials here. I saw one just a moment ago that was dedicated to the carriers who helped the soldiers during the time. From the 3rd Battalion, thanks to the Papuan carriers for their strength, humour and kindness, Kokoda Track and beyond 1942. There's also memorials to a lot of individuals here who served, from their families and from units that they served with. So it's a really lovely spot. It's quite peaceful. I say peaceful, it's surrounded by a car park. The hospital has grown quite extensively, and it's surrounded by a car park, but it's a nice little oasis of memory in the middle of quite a busy area of Sydney. I've just left the Rose Garden and I'm now standing in front of the memorial plaque to Bruce Kingsbury, who won the Victoria Cross in August 1942 at Ishirava, and it certainly was a well-earned Victoria Cross when he held off the Japanese with his Bren gun and killed a lot of Japanese and really was responsible for his entire company being saved from a Japanese attack. And he was unfortunately later on shot by a sniper and killed. So it's, like all these stories from Kokoda, heroism, mateship, and sacrifice all summed up in one action. I'm now walking along the main path which comprises the memorial walkway, and it's really, really well done. There's stations along each part of the pathway that connect to the history of the battle. So walking along the pathway from this direction, from the Rose Garden onwards, helps explain the battle. It unfolds as you walk along. And it's in a really interesting environment. It's down on the foreshore. It's quite a bushy environment. And it's too much to say that it reflects the jungle environment of New Guinea where the campaign was fought. But it's a nice spot for it. It's dark. There's trees crowding over the pathway. It's a nice spot. It's very, very well done. And as I walk along, I'm just coming up to one of the early paths here. Owers Corner, the famous Owers Corner, really the start of the track. And as you approach each spot, a little audio starts up describing what went on here. I'm just reading about the actions at Owers Corner, and I'm looking at a photo of a 25-pounder gun being pulled through the jungle. I have just this morning interviewed Lloyd Birdsall, who was one of the gunners on that gun at the moment when they stopped the Japanese by firing those guns from Owers Corner. So a little piece of history right there. I just spoke to one of the veterans this morning. It's fantastic. Look out for that podcast. It's coming up in a couple of weeks' time. So the first plaque here is Owers Corner, talking about the great work the gunners did, and about this is the spot where where they really stopped the Japanese from advancing on Port Moresby late during the Japanese advance. I'm continuing down along the Memorial Walkway and past famous sites such as Imita Ridge, the plaque honouring the actions there. I'm coming along past the children's playground, and it's led me to really the central point of the walkway, which is the education centre. And this is where school groups come in and, well, they still do. Veterans come down and talk to the school kids about their experiences on the Kokoda Track. Obviously, there's fewer and fewer veterans every year, and very soon, sadly, there won't be any left to tell their stories. But for the time being, at least, we do have veterans coming down talking to the school kids, which is fantastic. I'm just walking up to the education centre. and I'm seeing a bastion plaque. Now, these are things that any visitors to Australian battlefields will recognise. It's a bronze plaque that spells out basically the details of the battlefield that you're visiting, and there's one here. And they're sculpted by Ross Bastian, who is a dentist from Melbourne. And years ago, I think when he was visiting Gallipoli, he noted that there were no clear plaques outlining the Australian involvement. So he made it his mission to put these plaques together. And now they're on battlefields all over the world, Australian battlefields, just about in every corner of the world. So this one here is describing the actions on the Kokoda track. And there is another one, of course, at Kokoda, the same, which spells out the entire Kokoda campaign. In front of that plaque, we have a very special sculpture. This sculpture is based on a famous photograph that was taken during the Boonah and Gonah campaign, the Beachheads campaign, after the Battle of the Kokoda track. And it reflects the wonderful moment when Private Dick Whittington was escorted out of the jungle. He had a facial wound, and one of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels escorted him out of the jungle and to safety. And this is quite a beautiful sculpture based on that historic photograph of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angel helping Private Whittington as he walked along the track in the Boonah Gonah sector. So really lovely spot in front of a large tree. Right next to the Kokoda Cafe, a good spot to stop and have a cold drink or a meal. I've just passed the plaque for Iribiwa Range, which was the closest the Japanese got to Port Moresby during their advance across the Kokoda track. So by following the memorial track in this direction from the Rose Garden, we're following the Kokoda track from the Port Moresby side of the track. So we've passed Owa's Corner, which is the start of the track, and we're heading further along through the history. So this was the direction the Australians pushed the Japanese back in the second half of the campaign. As I walk through, really some beautiful bush right on the foreshore at Concord. It really is a lovely spot. I'm standing in front of the plaque now to the battles around Efogey. Now, this was really the guts of the action. This is where, on both sides, on both the Japanese advance and then the Australian counterattack that pushed them back, some really heavy fighting around Mission Ridge, Brigade Hill occurred. And this is really some of the toughest country of the Owen Stanleys, the famous log bridges that cross the rivers in this area. Some really horrific fighting in this area. Some very brave defence by the Australians right in the heart of the Kokoda track, and some pretty determined attacks by the Japanese, which were basically held off by the Australians for quite a while, but eventually they were forced to withdraw by superior numbers. I've now come to the plaque talking about Myola, which was a site of refuge for the troops. It was a dry lake bed where they were able to drop supplies, and later in the campaign they even evacuated casualties from here by light planes. So Myola was a bit of a godsend for the troops in the middle of this very harsh Kokoda country. I'm just coming up to one of the stations in time to hear the audio track, so let's hear a few seconds of that.
Your Creek is about halfway between Port Moresby and Boonah on the north coast. It was closed in by mountains, and the sun really reached into the wet, muddy valley, where the creek was crossed and recrossed by numerous small bridges made of logs.
Eora Creek was the site of an important battle during the October counter-offensive.
I've just come across a very interesting memorial to the Coast Watchers. The Coast Watchers, of course, operated behind Japanese lines. They were stationed on small islands throughout the Pacific and would basically radio in details of Japanese ships and aircraft coming towards the battle zones in New Guinea and also on Guadalcanal. They did absolutely essential work, very dangerous work. If they were discovered by the Japanese, they were executed almost immediately. Really dangerous work behind Japanese lines, and I have a huge amount of respect for the bravery of the men and the native scouts who operated as coast watchers throughout the war. I'm at the most important part of the memorial now, the memorial centrepiece, which has iconic images from the battle sandblasted onto granite slabs surrounding this really beautiful water feature. It's a really lovely spot, and seeing the faces of the men here who actually fought on the track as they're represented on these huge memorial tablets is really quite a moving thing. It's really well done. I'm standing in front of the plaque for Isurava, which must be one of the most famous actions of the entire Kokoda campaign. This is where Bruce Kingsbury won the VC. It's where probably the largest battle of the entire Kokoda track campaign occurred. probably about 500 Japanese were killed in fighting here, and many dozens of Australians were killed as well. This fighting all occurred at the beginning of the campaign as the Japanese made their first big effort to push through and push the Australians back. When the Australians came back, when they counterattacked a month later, they passed through here pretty well without incident. Nearing the end of the memorial track and the memorials to Boonah, Gonah and Sanananda, the great beachhead campaigns. Now, this is part of the whole Kokoda campaign that often gets overlooked, but there were actually many, many, many more times casualties in the beachhead battles at Boonah and Gonah and Sanananda than there were in the Kokoda track proper. A lot of veterans talked about this as much more difficult than the Kokoda track campaign. The Japanese were dug into pillboxes, and they basically had to root each one of them out. One by one, they had to overcome these Japanese pillboxes. They had to fight their way through, and the casualties were hugely heavy. It was a really desperate and difficult time of fighting. And so the beachhead battles, not as well known as some of the other actions on the Kokoda track, but just as important, and in some ways even more important. So that's the Kokoda Memorial Walkway in Concord in Sydney. It's really quite special. I hadn't been here before, but I'm glad I came down. I've just spent half an hour or so wandering around and reading the plaques and just really enjoying the atmosphere. It's a fantastic living memorial to those men who fought and died on the Kokoda track. One of our most famous battles in our history, definitely the most famous of the Second World War. So I really suggest next time you're in Sydney, you come down and check it out. It's really quite special. Thanks for tuning in to this special episode of the podcast, and I'll talk to you again soon.